The stars had always called to humanity, and in the year 2347, that call was finally answered with an invitation that would change everything. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the diplomatic vessel Resolute, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the magnificent towers of the Council's capital world grow larger in the view screen, and he felt his heart swell with pride for what his species had accomplished. 200 years of work had led to this moment, and humanity had earned its place among the stars through sacrifice and determination that few other species could match. The HFY Galactic Council represented 47 spacefaring civilizations that had maintained peace across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. And now Earth was about to become the 48th member of this ancient and powerful organization. Commander Lisa Grant stood beside the Admiral, her eyes bright with hope as she watched the alien ships escort them toward the gleaming station where the signing ceremony would take place. "We did it, sir," she said quietly, and there was wonder in her voice that she could not hide. Morrison nodded slowly, remembering all the generations who had dreamed of this day. And he thought of his daughter serving on the outer defense stations who had sent him a message of congratulations. Just that morning, the Council ambassadors greeted them with warm words and welcoming gestures, their various mouths and appendages forming what humans had learned to recognize as smiles. And the ceremony itself was beautiful beyond description. High Councilor Travex of the Siluri Collective personally placed the ceremonial seal on the treaty document, his 4 eyes gleaming with what appeared to be genuine pleasure as he welcomed humanity into the galactic community. "You have proven yourselves worthy," Travex declared in his translated voice. "And the Council embraces Earth as a valued member and ally in our continued pursuit of peace and prosperity." The celebration lasted for 3 days, and human delegates were treated to wonders they had only imagined in their wildest dreams. From gardens that floated in zero gravity to music that could be felt in the bones. Morrison allowed himself to believe that the future was bright, that humanity had finally found its place among the stars, and that the sacrifices of previous generations had been worth every moment of struggle. He was wrong. 6 months after the signing ceremony, everything changed in a single terrible night when the first distress signals came screaming across the communication channels from humanity's outer colonies. The Velthari Dominion, a hostile empire from the galaxy's outer rim that the Council had barely mentioned during negotiations, launched a massive invasion that swept across human space like a wave of destruction. Commander Grant was on duty when the signals began flooding in, and her face went pale as she realized the scale of what was happening. Colony after colony fell silent, their final transmissions filled with screams and explosions and desperate pleas for help that went unanswered. In the first 3 weeks, 17 billion human lives were lost, and the number kept climbing as the Velthari pushed deeper into Earth's territory with a fleet that seemed endless. Grant sent urgent requests to the Council for the reinforcements that had been promised in the treaty, her fingers trembling as she typed message after message to every ambassador she could reach. The responses never came. When she finally managed to get through to High Councilor Travex directly, his image appeared on her screen with an expression that she did not recognize at first. And then she understood that it was not confusion or concern on his alien face. It was satisfaction. "The Council regrets that it cannot spare resources at this time," Travex said in a voice that held no regret at all. "And we trust that humanity will handle this situation with the resilience your species is known for." The channel closed before Grant could respond, and she stood in the silent communication center as the truth crashed over her like a physical blow. Admiral Morrison received the news in his quarters aboard the Resolute, and his hand shook as he read the intelligence report that one of their spies had managed to smuggle out of the Council's inner chambers. The Council had known about the Velthari invasion for decades, and they had known that the Dominion's expansion would eventually threaten their own territories, they had needed a buffer zone, a species to absorb the first wave of destruction and slow the enemy advance. And they had found the perfect candidates in the K. Eager and trusting humans who so desperately wanted to belong. Earth had not been invited to join the council as a member. Earth had been recruited as a sacrifice. Morrison watched the final transmission from the outer defense stations where his daughter had served, and he saw the Velthury ships tear through the human vessels like they were made of paper. His daughter's station exploded in a flash of light that burned itself into his memory forever. And something inside him died in that moment while something else was born. Captain Daniel Hayes found the Admiral standing alone in the observation deck, staring out at the stars with eyes that had gone cold and hard. "Sir," Hayes said carefully, "we have received orders to fall back to the inner colonies and prepare for evacuation." Morrison did not move for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was flat and empty of all emotion. "They used us, Daniel," he said quietly, "and they watched our people die, and they felt nothing." Hayes did not know what to say, so he simply stood beside his commander and waited. "How many ships do we have left?" Morrison asked. 312 combat-capable vessels, sir, and perhaps another 100 civilian transports that can be converted for evacuation." Morrison finally turned away from the window, and Hayes saw something in his eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. "Contact every surviving human vessel," the Admiral ordered, "and tell them to gather at the following coordinates." He pulled up a star chart and pointed to a region of space that was marked with warning symbols in every known language. "The dead zone?" "Sir," Hayes said with surprise. "No species goes there because of the radiation storms and unstable stars." "Exactly," Morrison replied. "Which means no species will look for us there." Hayes hesitated for just a moment before asking the question that burned in his mind. "What do we do after that?" "Sir," Morrison looked back at the stars one final time, and his voice was as cold as the void between them when he answered, "We survive. And then we make them regret what they have done." The evacuation began that night, and every human who could reach a ship fled toward the dead zone, while the Velthury continued their advance. Lisa Grant coordinated the retreat from her command station, her voice steady even as tears ran down her face for every signal that went silent behind them. 12 million humans escaped into the darkness, leaving behind everything they had built and everyone they had lost. Council watched them go and felt nothing but relief that the buffer zone had served its purpose. They believed humanity was finished, broken and scattered, and no longer their concern. They had no idea what they had created in that moment of betrayal. No longer their betrayal, and no longer their concern. They had no idea what they had created in that moment of betrayal. No understanding of what humanity would become when pushed to the edge of extinction. The galaxy would learn, and the lesson would be written in fire across the stars. But for now, the survivors fled into the dead zone with nothing but their ships and their grief and a burning determination that would not be extinguished. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the Resolute as they crossed into the radiation clouds that would hide them from the galaxy. "This is not the end," he said to his crew, "and I promise you that one day we will return." The stars disappeared behind the swirling clouds of the dead zone, and humanity began its long journey into darkness. They would emerge 30 years later as something the galaxy had never seen before, and the Council would finally understand the terrible mistake they had made when they chose to betray Earth. But that story was yet to come. And for now, there was only survival and grief, and the slow-burning ember of vengeance that would one day ignite into an inferno. The Dead Zone lived up to its name in every way that mattered, and the radiation storms that swept through the region forced the human fleet to move constantly just to stay alive. Admiral Morrison led his people deeper into the hazardous space, searching for any place where they could stop running and begin the long work of rebuilding what had been lost. Chief Engineer Maria Santos was the one who found it. A cluster of asteroids hidden in the shadow of a dying star, where the radiation levels were just low enough for humans to survive with proper shielding. It is not much, she told Morrison when she presented her findings, but we can hollow out these rocks and build shelters inside them. Morrison looked at the scans and saw not just asteroids, but the foundation of humanity's future. Make it happen, he ordered. And we will call this place Haven. The work began immediately, and every human who could hold a tool contributed to the effort of carving homes out of solid rock. Lisa Gran organized the civilian population into work teams, her military training proving valuable in ways she had never expected as she coordinated thousands of people in the massive construction. Project children who had lost their parents worked alongside adults who had lost their children, and the grief they shared became a bond that held them together when everything else had fallen apart. The first year was the hardest, and they lost nearly 1,000 people to accidents and radiation sickness and the simple despair that came from losing everything. But humanity did not give up. And by the end of that first year, the main habitat was complete, and the survivors finally had a place they could call home. Maria Santos turned her attention to the alien technology they had brought with them, equipment and weapons and ship components they had acquired during their brief membership in the Council. The Council species are old, she explained to the team of young engineers she had gathered, and they have used the same technology for thousands of years because they stopped trying to improve it. She held up a piece of a Siluri shield generator and turned it over in her hands with a look of disgust. This design is inefficient in at least a dozen ways that I can see, and no one has bothered to fix it because they forgot how to innovate. Dr. Kevin Bradley joined her research team with a specialty in propulsion systems, and his eyes widened when he studied the Council's faster-than-light technology. They use hyperspace lanes, he said with growing excitement. Fixed pathways through subspace that their ships must follow to travel between stars. What is wrong with that? Asked his daughter Rachel, who had survived the evacuation as a young pilot and now helped her father with his research. Nothing is wrong with it, Kevin replied, except that it means anyone who controls those lanes controls all travel and trade in the galaxy. He pulled up his calculations on a holographic display and began to explain his theory. I believe we can create a different kind of drive, one that does not need the lanes at all, and our ships would be able to jump anywhere in the galaxy without warning. Maria Santos looked at his numbers and felt a smile spread across her face for the first time since the evacuation. Get to work, she said simply. 5 years passed, and the human population slowly began to grow again as children were born in the underground cities of Haven. General Marcus Cole took charge of military planning, and he spent long hours studying every piece of intelligence they could gather about both the Velthory Dominion and the Council forces. The Council builds their ships large and impressive, he told his officers during one of their strategy sessions, with crews of thousands and weapons designed more for show than for actual combat. He pulled up images of Velthory warships that made his human officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Dominion builds for intimidation and brute force, and their tactics rely on overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. Captain Daniel Hayes, who had become one of Cole's most trusted advisors, leaned forward with interest. What is our advantage then? He asked. Cole smiled grimly and changed the display to show the new ship designs that the engineering teams had been developing. We build small and fast and deadly, he answered. And we use automation so that a human crew of 50 can operate a ship that would require thousands on a Council vessel. The new ships began taking shape in secret shipyards hidden throughout the asteroid field. and each one was given a name that carried the weight of humanity's suffering. The Retribution was the first to be completed, followed by the Silent Thunder and the Consequence, and dozens more. Rachel Bradley became a test pilot for her father's new drive system, and she was the first human to make an uncharted jump through subspace without using the hyperspace lanes. "It works," she reported with a voice that shook with excitement and relief. "And I appeared exactly where I intended with no warning and no detection." The tactical implications were staggering, and General Cole immediately began revising his battle plans to take advantage of this new capability. 20 years after the evacuation, Admiral Morrison called a meeting of all the senior leaders in the largest chamber of Haven. His hair had gone gray, and his face showed the weight of everything he had carried, but his eyes still burned with the same cold fire that ignited on the day of the betrayal. "We have spent 2 decades hiding and building and preparing," he said to the assembled commanders and scientists and engineers. "And I believe the time is approaching when we must decide what we are going to do with what we have created." Lisa Grant, now an admiral herself with command of the new stealth fleet, stood to address the gathering. "Our intelligence indicates that the Velthari have expanded their territory significantly since our evacuation, and they now threaten several Council species directly." She displayed a map of the current galactic situation and pointed to the areas under Dominion control. "The Council has done nothing to stop them, just as they did nothing to help us, and they continue to sacrifice smaller species to protect themselves." A murmur of anger ran through the chamber, and Morrison let it build for a moment before raising his hand for silence. "The question before us is simple," he continued. "Do we remain hidden here forever, or do we return to the galaxy and show them what humanity has become?" General Cole was the first to respond, and his voice carried the certainty of a man who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. "We cannot hide forever, and eventually someone will find us here. And if we wait too long, we will lose the advantage of surprise that may be our greatest weapon." Kevin Bradley added his voice to the discussion with the perspective of a scientist who understood what they had achieved. "The technology we have developed is generations ahead of anything the Council or the Dominion possesses, and that gap will close if we wait too long." Admiral Grant spoke last, and her words carried the weight of all the losses she had witnessed. "We owe it to everyone we lost to make sure their deaths meant something, and we owe it to our children to build a future where humanity will never be betrayed again." Morrison looked around the chamber at the faces of the people who had survived and built and prepared alongside him for 2 decades. "Then we are agreed," he said quietly. "And in 10 years, we will be ready to show the galaxy what happens when you underestimate humanity." The work accelerated after that meeting, and every human in Haven dedicated themselves to the final preparations for their return. New ships were built at a faster pace, and pilots trained in simulators that replicated every known enemy vessel and tactic. 30 years after they had fled into the dead zone, the human fleet assembled in formation for the first time. Admiral Grant stood on the bridge of the flagship Endurance and looked at the display showing over 1,000 ships of various sizes, all of them crewed by humans who had never known Earth, but who carried the memory of its loss in their hearts. "The galaxy thinks we are dead," she said to her crew, "and it is time to prove them wrong." The fleet powered up their revolutionary drives and prepared to make the first jump back into the galaxy they had been forced to abandon. The Council was about to receive a lesson they would never forget, and the Velthari Dominion was about to discover that the species they thought they had exterminated had returned with a vengeance that would shake the foundations of their empire. Humanity was coming home, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Velthari Supply Depot at Nexus 7 was considered the most secure installation in the Outer Territories, protected by 40 defense platforms and a permanent garrison of 2. 100 warships that patrolled the surrounding space. Constantly, Commander Rachel Bradley studied the holographic display of the target from her position aboard the stealth cruiser Phantom, memorizing every detail of the enemy defenses that she would soon be penetrating. All wings report ready, came the voice of her tactical officer through the communication system. And we are holding position at the designated jump coordinates. Rachel took a deep breath and thought about her father, back on Haven, the man who had made this moment possible with his revolutionary drive technology. And she wished he could see what his daughter was about to accomplish. Initiate jump sequence, she ordered calmly. And all ships will emerge inside the defense perimeter at the pre-calculated positions. The stars stretched and twisted around her ship as the drive engaged. And then reality snapped back into focus, and she found herself exactly where she had intended to be. Deep inside the supposedly impregnable defenses of Nexus 7, the Valkyrie had no time to react. No warning that death had appeared in their midst. And the first plasma rounds were already tearing through their hulls, before their sensors could even register the presence of the human. Ships, all wings. Weapons free, Rachel announced over the fleet channel. And the battle began in earnest. The human ships moved like predators through the confused mass of enemy vessels. Their smaller size and superior maneuverability, allowing them to dodge the heavy weapons that the Valkyrie fired blindly in all directions. One of the defense platforms exploded in a brilliant flash as a concentrated volley struck its reactor core. And then another followed as the human gunners found their targets. With deadly precision, Rachel guided her ship through the chaos with movements that were almost instinctive, her mind working faster than conscious thought as she identified threats and opportunities in the swirling battle. A Valkyrie cruiser tried to bring its main weapons to bear on her ship, but she was already moving, slipping beneath its firing arc and unleashing a barrage that ripped through its engine section. The cruiser went dark and began to drift, and Rachel was already engaging her next target before the first one had stopped tumbling. 17 minutes after the battle began, it was over, and Nexus 7 was nothing but a field of debris and dying fires. All ships report status, Rachel ordered as her crew began the post-battle assessment. The responses came in one by one, and she felt a surge of pride as she realized that they had not lost a single vessel in the attack. Enemy communications array was destroyed before they could send the distress signal, reported her communications officer. And no one knows what happened here. Rachel smiled grimly and gave the order to jump back to their staging area, leaving nothing behind but destruction and mystery across the galaxy. Similar attacks were happening at the same moment. Coordinated strikes against Valkyrie installations that had been carefully chosen to cause maximum disruption to the enemy war machine fuel depots vanished in nuclear fire. Communication relays went silent, and shipyards were reduced to twisted metal by weapons that came from nowhere and disappeared. Just as quickly, Admiral Lisa Grant monitored the reports from her command center aboard the flagship Endurance, watching the operation unfold exactly as they had planned. The Valkyrie are in complete disarray, reported Captain Sam Wheeler from his position at the tactical station, and their command structure is struggling to understand what is happening. Grant nodded with satisfaction and pulled up the larger strategic map that showed the ripple effects of their attacks spreading through enemy territory. They will pull ships from their front lines to protect their infrastructure, she observed, which means the species they have been oppressing will have a chance to breathe. Wheeler frowned slightly at this statement and asked the question that had been bothering him. Admiral, are we trying to help the Council species, even after what they did to us? Grant turned to face him with an expression that was difficult to read. We are not doing this for the Council, she replied carefully. But there are billions of innocent beings suffering under Valkyrie occupation who had nothing to do with the betrayal of Earth. She returned her attention to the map and continued her explanation. Our enemy is the Velthari Dominion and the Council leadership. Not the ordinary people of those worlds who are just trying to survive. Wheeler accepted this answer and returned to his duties. But the conversation had highlighted one of the ongoing debates within the human leadership about the ultimate purpose of their return. Some wanted pure vengeance against everyone who had failed them, while others, like Grant, argued for a more measured approach that distinguished between the guilty and the innocent. Admiral Morrison had made the final decision, and his orders were clear. The Velthari would be destroyed as a military power, and the Council would be humiliated and diminished. But humanity would not become the monsters they had been treated as the attacks continued for 3 months. And each strike was designed to confuse and terrify the enemy. While avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties, the Velthari leadership grew increasingly paranoid, seeing threats everywhere and trusting no one. And their alliance with minor powers began to crumble as those powers realized the Dominion could not protect them. Intelligence. Reports indicated that High Counselor Trevax had demanded answers from his intelligence services about the identity of the attackers, and his fury had been terrible to witness when they could provide no answers. "We have intercepted fragments of their communications," one of the Siluri intelligence officers had reportedly told him, "and the language appears to be human." Trevax had refused to believe it at first, insisting that the humans had been exterminated 30 years ago, and that this must be some kind of deception. But the evidence kept mounting, and eventually, even he could not deny the truth. The humans had survived, and they had returned with capabilities that defied everything the Council understood about technology and warfare. Ambassador Keela 9 of the Methari Federation was the first Council member to suggest reaching out to the humans, arguing that they should attempt to repair the relationship before it was too late. "They were wronged by our predecessors," she told the emergency council session. "And perhaps if we acknowledge this and offer assistance against our common enemy, they will be willing to talk." Others were less optimistic, and some argued for a preemptive strike against the humans before they could turn their attention from the Velthari to the Council itself. The debate raged for weeks while the human attacks continued unabated, and the Dominion lost more territory with each passing day. Finally, the Council voted to attempt diplomatic contact, and a message was sent on all frequencies, inviting the human leadership to a peace conference. The response came not through official channels, but through a holographic projection that appeared unbidden in the Council chamber itself, demonstrating a level of technological capability that sent shockwaves through the assembled ambassadors. Admiral Morrison's face filled the display. Older now, but instantly recognizable to those who remembered the eager young species that had joined the Council so long ago. "You want to talk," he said without preamble. "And after 30 years of silence, you suddenly find your voices." Trevax attempted to maintain his dignity and responded with the formal greeting appropriate for diplomatic discussions. Morrison cut him off with a gesture of contempt. "Save your ceremonies for someone who cares," he said coldly, "because I am not here to negotiate." The Council members shifted uncomfortably as they realized this would not be the conversation they had hoped for. "We know what you did," Morrison continued, "and we have proof of every decision, every meeting, every vote that led to the sacrifice of Earth." Documents began appearing on screens throughout the chamber. Records that should have been classified forever. Evidence of guilt that could not be denied. "You used us as a shield, and you watched our people die. And you felt nothing but relief that the threat had been delayed for another generation." Trevax started to protest, to offer explanations and justifications, but Morrison simply talked over him with a voice like ice. "The old order is finished," the Admiral declared, "and humanity will determine its own future from this point forward." He paused to let his words sink in before delivering his final message. "Stay out of our way, and we will not consider you enemies, but interfere with our operations against the Dominion, and you will learn exactly what we are capable of." The projection ended, and the council sat in shocked silence as they contemplated a future they had never imagined. The species they had sacrificed had returned, and nothing would ever be the same again. The war was about to enter a new phase, and the galaxy would soon learn why humanity should never have been underestimated. The Velthari Dominion had ruled the Outer Rim for over 3,000 years, through a combination of overwhelming military force and absolute brutality against anyone who dared to resist. Emperor Korthax sat upon his throne of black stone and listened to reports of defeat after defeat, with a growing rage that made his advisors tremble with fear. "How is this possible?" he demanded, his massive fist slamming against the armrests of his seat. "We destroyed the humans 30 years ago and scattered their survivors like dust in the void." His chief military commander, a scarred veteran named Varth, bowed low before delivering yet another piece of unwelcome news. "They have technology we cannot match. Great One and their ships appear without warning from directions that should be impossible." Korthax rose from his throne and descended the steps toward his commander with murder in his eyes. "Then find where they are hiding and crush them," he snarled. "Send every ship we have if necessary." Varth kept his gaze fixed on the floor as he delivered the truth his emperor did not want to hear. "We have searched for their base of operations throughout every sector we control, and we have found nothing, and our fleets cannot defend against attacks that come from everywhere at once." The emperor grabbed his commander by the throat and lifted him off the ground with one hand. His alien features twisted with fury. "You are telling me that a species we nearly exterminated is now bringing the Dominion to its knees, and you have no solution?" Varth choked out a response despite the pressure crushing his windpipe. "We need allies. Great One, and perhaps if we approach the Council, they would assist us against this common threat." Korthax dropped his commander in disgust and turned away to stare out the window of his throne room at the fleet gathered above his homeworld. "The Council is weak," he declared, "and they will not help us because they fear the humans even more than we do." He was right about that much. For the Galactic Council was in complete chaos as they tried to determine how to respond to the new reality that humanity represented High Counselor Trevax had called emergency session after emergency session, each one devolving into arguments and accusations, as the various species blamed each other for the decisions that had led to this disaster. "We should have treated the humans fairly from the beginning," argued Ambassador Keelanine during one particularly heated debate. "And none of this would be happening if we had honored our treaty obligations." Counselor Marath of the Ulani dismissed this statement with a wave of his tentacles. "The humans were always aggressive and unpredictable," he insisted, "and we were right to use them as a buffer against the Dominion. And look where that strategy has brought us." Keelanine responded sharply. "The Velthari are collapsing, and the humans control half the territory that used to be theirs." The argument continued without resolution, just as every argument had for the past 6 months. While humanity systematically dismantled the Dominion's military infrastructure, Admiral Grant directed the campaign from the Endurance with a precision that her enemies found terrifying, coordinating hundreds of simultaneous operations across dozens of systems. Her tactical displays showed the current state of the war in colors that shifted constantly as new reports came in from every sector. "The Velthari have pulled back to defend their core systems," reported Captain Wheeler as he analyzed the latest intelligence, "and they have abandoned everything beyond a 20 light-year radius of their homeworld." Grant studied the map and made calculations in her head about supply lines and reinforcement schedules. "That gives us an opportunity," she said thoughtfully. "And I want to liberate the occupied worlds before the Dominion can regroup. The liberation campaign began 3 days later, and human ships appeared above worlds that had known nothing but Velthury oppression. For Generations, Commander Rachel Bradley led the assault on Callith Prime, a world that had been conquered by the Dominion a century ago, and whose population had been enslaved ever since her ships swept aside the small garrison left behind by the retreating Velthury. And then she landed her ground forces to secure the planet's major cities. The Callith people emerged from their hiding places with disbelief written across their features. Unable to understand what was happening, Rachel met with their elders in the ruins of what had once been their capital building, and she spoke to them through a translator device that converted her words into their language. The Dominion will not return to this world, she promised them, and humanity offers you the choice that was never given to us. The elder, who seemed to be their leader, stepped forward with tears streaming down his alien face. "Why are you helping us?" he asked in a voice that trembled with emotion. "When we did nothing to help you, when your people were being destroyed." Rachel considered the question carefully before she answered. "Because suffering does not justify more suffering," she said finally. "And we will not become what we hate just to have our revenge." Similar scenes played out across dozens of liberated worlds, and the people who had lived under Velthury rule for generations found themselves free for the first time in living memory. Not everyone in the human leadership agreed with this approach, and there were heated debates about whether they should be helping anyone who had stood by, while Earthburn General Cole argued for a harder line during one strategy meeting aboard the Endurance. "These species watched us die," he reminded his fellow commanders, "and now we are spending resources to liberate them instead of focusing on our real enemies." Admiral Morrison, who had come aboard for this particular meeting, listened to both sides of the argument before rendering his decision. "I understand the anger," he said slowly, "because I feel it too every time I remember what was done to us." He paused and looked around at the faces of the people who had followed him through 3 decades of exile and preparation. But humanity has always been defined by our capacity for compassion as much as our capacity for destruction, and I will not let the Council's betrayal destroy that part of who we are. Grant spoke up in support of Morrison's position. "The species we are liberating will remember what we did for them," she pointed out, "and they will become allies who chose to stand with us freely rather than subjects who submit out of fear." The debate continued, but the decision had already been made, and humanity would pursue a path of liberation rather than conquest. This approach proved to be strategically brilliant as well as morally sound, for the freed worlds provided intelligence and resources, and volunteers who wanted to fight alongside their liberators. The Velthury found themselves increasingly isolated as former allies and neutral parties turned against them, and the Dominion that had terrorized the Outer Rim for millennia began to crumble from within. Emperor Korthax made one final desperate attempt to turn the tide by leading his remaining fleet in a massive assault against the human forces that had gathered near the Callith system. It was the largest space battle in recorded history, with thousands of ships clashing in a sphere of destruction that could be seen from neighboring star systems. Admiral Grant commanded the human fleet from the bridge of the Endurance, a voice calm and steady as she directed her forces against the overwhelming numbers of the Velthury Armada. "All ships maintain formation," she ordered, "and trust your training and your technology." The battle lasted for 14 hours, and the outcome was never truly in doubt. Despite the disparity in numbers, human ships danced through the enemy fleet with movements that the Velthury simply could not match, and every shot they fired seemed to find a critical system or weak point that the enemy had not known they possessed. Emperor Korthax watched his flagship burn around him as human boarding teams carved through his personal guards with a ferocity that even a Valkyrie warrior could respect Rachel Bradley was the one who found him in his throne room, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen defenders, and still defiant even in defeat. "You will not break me," he snarled at her. "And the Dominion will rise again." Rachel holstered her weapon and looked at him with something that might have been pity. "No," she said quietly. "It will not." The battle ended with the complete destruction of the Valkyrie fleet and the capture of their emperor. And the news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The species that had conquered countless worlds and enslaved billions of beings had been defeated by the very people they had tried to exterminate 30 years ago. Humanity had won. And now the galaxy waited to see what they would do with their victory. The surrender ceremony took place aboard the human flagship, Endurance, in a chamber that had been specifically designed for this moment, with recording devices transmitting the event to every inhabited world in the galaxy. Emperor Korthax knelt before Admiral Grant in chains forged from the metal of his own destroyed warships, his pride finally broken by the reality of his complete defeat. The Valkyrie Dominion unconditionally surrenders to the human alliance, Grant announced in a voice that carried across the chamber and into the homes of billions of watching beings. "And from this day forward, the crimes of your empire will be answered for." She read the terms of surrender in clear and simple language so that no one could claim to misunderstand. The Dominion would be confined to their home system and forbidden from building military vessels for a period of 1,000 years. And their conquered territories would be returned to the species who had originally inhabited them. Korthax listened to each condition with growing despair as he realized that everything his empire had built over 3 millennia was being taken away in a matter of minutes. "You will remember this day," Grant told him when the reading was complete, "and your descendants will remember it for generations to come as the day the Dominion paid the price for its cruelty." The Emperor was led away to begin his imprisonment, and the assembled witnesses erupted into cheers that could be heard throughout the ship. Admiral Morrison watched the celebration from a quiet corner of the chamber, his aged face showing a mixture of satisfaction and weariness that came from finally reaching the end of a journey that had consumed his entire adult life. Captain Hayes, now an admiral himself, found his old commander and stood beside him in companionable silence. "We did it," Hayes said finally. "And everything we suffered was worth it to reach this moment." Morrison nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. "The war is over," he acknowledged. "But the harder work begins now, and we must decide what kind of power we want to be in this galaxy." The question had been debated throughout the human leadership for months, and now that victory was achieved, it could no longer be avoided. Some argued that humanity should seize the opportunity to become the dominant force in the galaxy, using their superior technology to establish an empire that would never be threatened again. Others, including Morrison and Grant, pushed for a different approach entirely. The Galactic Council requested a meeting 1 week after the surrender ceremony, and Morrison agreed to attend in person despite the objections of his security advisors. He arrived at the council chambers aboard a single ship, a gesture of confidence that sent a clear message to the assembled representatives. High Counselor Trevax rose to greet him with a formal bow that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. "Admiral Morrison," he said carefully, "the Council wishes to express its deep regret for the actions taken against humanity in the past." Morrison listened to the apology without changing his expression, letting the silence stretch until the council members began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Regret," he repeated finally, "is easy to express when you have lost and have no other choice." Trevax flinched at the coldness in the Admiral's voice, but continued with the prepared speech. "We wish to invite humanity to rejoin the Council as a full member with all the rights and privileges that entails, and we offer reparations for the losses you suffered. Morrison shook his head slowly. "We will not rejoin the Council," he declared, "because the Council represents a way of thinking that we reject completely." He stepped forward and addressed not just Travax, but all the representatives present. "You built a system where the powerful exploited the weak and called it peace. And when you were threatened, you sacrificed others to protect yourselves." His voice rose as decades of anger finally found its proper target. "We will not be part of that system. And we will not pretend that your apologies erase what was done." Ambassador Keelanine raised her hand and spoke with genuine remorse in her voice. "Then what would you have us do, Admiral? And how can we begin to make amends for the past?" Morrison turned to face her with a look that was slightly less hostile than what he had shown the others. "You can prove your sincerity through actions rather than words," he replied. "And you can begin by treating every species in this galaxy with the respect and fairness you denied to humanity." He outlined his vision for a new order in the galaxy. One where no species would be sacrificed for the convenience of others, and where power came with responsibility rather than privilege. "We are building something called the Human Alliance," he explained. "And membership is open to any species that agrees to our principles of mutual defense and equal treatment." Several council members exchanged worried glances at this announcement, recognizing the threat it posed to their own power and influence. "This alliance will stand apart from the council," Morrison continued, "and we will neither ask for your approval nor seek your permission." The meeting ended without resolution, but the lines had been drawn clearly for everyone to see in the months that followed. Species that had been liberated from the Dominion joined the Human Alliance in growing numbers, drawn by humanity's reputation for fairness and the protection that membership offered. Even some council members began to quietly explore the possibility of leaving the old organization and joining the new one, recognizing that the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted permanently. Admiral Morrison retired from active service 2 years after the surrender ceremony, his work finally complete, and his body tired from carrying the weight of humanity's survival for so long. He gave one final address to the people of the Alliance before stepping down, and his words were recorded and preserved for future generations. "We were betrayed by those who should have protected us," he said, "and we were nearly destroyed by those who saw us as nothing more than a useful sacrifice." He paused and looked at the camera with eyes that still burned with the fire that had sustained him through the darkest years. "But we did not become what they are, and we did not abandon our principles or our compassion, even when we had every reason to give in to hatred." He smiled for the first time in what felt like decades. "We built something better. Not an empire based on fear and exploitation, but a coalition based on earned trust and mutual respect." The applause that greeted his words was thunderous, and Morrison stepped away from the podium with the knowledge that he had fulfilled his promise to the billions who had died in the betrayal. Commander Rachel Bradley took command of her own fleet and patrolled the waters of Alliance space, protecting the worlds that had chosen to join humanity's vision for the future. One of her young officers asked her during a quiet moment what humanity's ultimate goal was, and she thought about the question for a long time before answering. "The Council saw us as disposable," she said finally, "and the Dominion saw us as prey to be hunted and destroyed." She looked out at the stars that had once seemed so threatening during their years in exile. "We are going to build a galaxy where no species ever has to feel that way again, where no one is sacrificed for the convenience of others and no one is abandoned when they need help." The young officer nodded thoughtfully and asked another question. "Do you think we can really change how the galaxy works?" Rachel smiled with the confidence of someone who had seen the impossible become reality. "We already have," she replied, "and we will keep working until the change is permanent." The Human Alliance continued to grow in the years that followed, And the principles that Morrison had established became the foundation for a new era in galactic history. The Council eventually reformed itself along similar lines, forced by competition to treat its members better than it ever had before. And throughout the galaxy, the story was told of the species that had been betrayed and nearly exterminated, but had returned stronger than ever, and chose to build rather than destroy. That was humanity's greatest victory. Not the military conquest or the political power, but the proof that compassion and determination could overcome even the darkest betrayal. The galaxy had observed humanity deploy everything they had. Their ingenuity and their courage and their refusal to surrender their values, even in the face of extinction. And in the end, that was what made them the most remarkable species the galaxy had ever known. Not their weapons or their technology or their military prowess, their humanity.